Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences Bioscience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. Today, I was very lucky to be joined by three guests for a lively discussion about race and ecology. And those guests are Dr. Karen Bailey, Assistant Professor in the Environmental Studies Program at the University of Colorado Boulder, Dr. Naima Harris, Incoming Associate Professor in the School of the Environment at Yale University and Director of the Applied Wildlife Ecology Lab, and Dr. Senayit Barak, Carolina Postdoctoral Fellow for Faculty Diversity at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Before we get into the episode, though, I wanted to draw your attention to one of the links in the show notes. It's to Dr. Bailey's podcast, which is called The Creature Connection, and it's all about exploring fictional worlds and the ways that people interact with them. I think you'll find a lot of resonance with the topics that we discussed today, and it's just a great show. So please pause this episode for a moment and go subscribe over there, and we'll welcome you back in just a moment. Moving on to today's topic, our guests will be discussing the recently published article, Inclusive Sustainability Approaches in Common Pool Resources from the Perspective of Blackologists. Our guests do an excellent job of describing the article. Before we move on to that discussion, though, I want to talk very briefly about the context in which it appears. I think we're all familiar with the idea of science as a purely objective form of inquiry. Lately, though, that notion has been reconsidered, both in the pages of bioscience and elsewhere. The problem isn't necessarily, flawed experimental design or manipulated data, but that often when we look at science through the lens of history, we find researchers whose identities, often as members of xenophobic and racist societies, are very much enmeshed in their work. And the results of that can often be found in things like so-called fortress conservation, in which indigenous communities have often been excluded from their traditional lands. And there's also an appalling strand of racist nativism that's deeply woven through much of the history of American environmentalism. We'll talk more about that during the episode, but I think it's important to note that much of what our guests described today is aimed at addressing that history. And so I encourage all of our listeners to explore the topic more. Please check the show notes. There will be a few links, but for right now, let's go to the interview. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, great. So to get us started, I thought we'd start talking about something that's in the title. It's a word that I was unfamiliar with, and it's Blackologists. And Naima, maybe you can get us started with a little bit of a definition and explanation there of that term.
Yeah, we fully recognize that's not common language. We're not going around hearing the term Blackologist. But there are other terms that we perhaps are more familiar with. You may hear someone introduce themselves as a virologist, a person that studies viruses, or an ornithologist, a person that studies birds. Well, with us using this term Blackologist, we're actually not saying the people that study blackness, right? That's not what we're saying. Instead, we're saying that blackness, our identities, are influencing the science, the way that we do the science, the questions that we ask, the approaches that we use, and the type of impact we aim for our science to have.
Okay, and this is also reflecting, the fact that other people's identities throughout the course of the history of science have also influenced the way that they conduct their work.
Correct. That it's this recognition of this intersectionality, that your identity and the facets, the many attributes of who you are as a scientist influence the way that you work. And despite the fact that we want to present science always as this objective and kind of insular narrative, the reality is that our identities, our culture, our language, our experiences, our biases all influence the science. And so we're just highlighting that as Black people, that our identities and the collective experiences, some of which are shared, influence our process, again, our approach and the impact of our scholarship. The considerations that we have to navigate and move in a certain way in the profession explicitly because of being Black.
Okay, great. And we'll talk a little more about that later. And we'll also talk about some of the history that this is, against the backdrop of. But I think it makes sense now, since this is going to be a lot about the intersection of identity and science, for you all to tell us a little bit about yourselves. And I'm interested in kind of, what's the guiding light? What's the driving transformational early experience that is, kind of the reason why you do what you do now? Karen, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, sure. So I was sort of from childhood always interested in outdoors and the environment. I loved animals, I loved dirt, and I loved sort of existing in that space. I think like many people who have an interest in the environment, I didn't really know what career opportunities were out there. So for a while, I wanted to be a veterinarian, which is common, or like Steve Irwin, right? Like that's what we saw. And then I shadowed a dog cat vet and an equine vet, and I hated it. Like, it was miserable. And like both versions. And I realized that was not what I wanted to do. And I think that also speaks to the importance of figuring out what you don't like as much as the importance of figuring out what you do like. And when I was in high school, I had the opportunity to go to the Teton Mountain Range in Wyoming with a sort of, let's take the kids from, and I'm from Los Angeles urban center. Let's take kids from these urban centers to the outdoors to expose them to field ecology, essentially is what it was. And this is the Teton Science School, which I just actually had a chance to reconnect with one of my former instructors from there, which is really, really, really wonderful. But it basically helped me to understand what field science could be and how I could be outside in nature, learning and studying and doing science and research. And so that was the path I took. There was also a moment later when I was doing my dissertation work where I realized I was more interested in human environment interactions and kind of the social science piece as well, thinking about those relationships with the environment as well. So yeah, that's sort of my trajectory.
So I'll chime in since we have a similar narrative, and of course I think seeing these kind of representation on television shows, not seeing myself represented, so not really necessarily thinking that it was something I could do, even though it was something that I liked and was inherently and kind of innately passionate about. Lots of kids grow up liking animals, even city folks like myself from Philadelphia. But my transformative experience came through an internship program at the Philadelphia Zoo, where I got to go to Kenya when I was in 9th grade. And so all these animals that I saw on TV and actually being there and witnessing and seeing lions hunt, I said, whatever this is called, this is what I want to be. I didn't really know the concepts of conservation biology or wildlife. I just knew that it wasn't a vet and it wasn't a zookeeper. It was outside in nature studying, right? And so I just said, as I was growing up, I wanted to be a scientist. And that was the extent of it.
Makes sense, Senai?
Yeah, I think for me there have been various formative experience, some that are more direct and others that are a bit indirect. I'll start with the indirect part. I think, when I think of science, I think of storytelling, and I think storytelling was very much part of my family. I actually grew up in the Netherlands, something you probably wouldn't expect. My family is originally from Eritrea and East Africa. And so there's an East African community in the Netherlands, and oftentimes they would gather together and tell each other stories about, where they grew up, which village, which corner of the city. And a lot of times I was fascinated listening to their stories and also sort of their insights of, how certain things came about, and effectively their analysis about situations in the region. And sort of related to that, I was a big fan. I don't know if any of you remember the show Columbo, which was a detective series. I used to watch it in the Netherlands, but I was always fascinated by Columbo because, he was wearing this old-looking, raggy, raincoat, and he was trying to solve this mystery, oftentimes involving lots of rich people. But he always kind of looked a bit, for a lack of a better word, a little bit stupid, a little bit dumb, so to speak. And they always thought they were cleverer than Columbo. But by the end of the series, you would always realize that he was solving the puzzle, the murder mystery. And there was something about that process, even though at the time I wasn't thinking about, being a scientist and the sort of profession of scientist. When I reflect back on it, I do sort of think of, that role of a lot of that, a lot of the work that we do is asking these big questions. Oftentimes, we don't quite expect to resolve them, but it's really that process that's exciting, and trying to appear a little bit confused at times, that could possibly result into, finding or unlocking the mystery. So I think for me, it's those two processes that have sort of indirectly affected my interest in science. But I think, when I moved to the United States and I started off at a community college, I sort of got taking courses and interacting with professors at the community college. I got sort of excited about science because it kind of reflected this storytelling process. And then later on, as an undergraduate and graduate student, I had the opportunity to do ecology and travel to mostly South America and firsthand experience what an ecologist or what a scientist actually does in the field. So I think that the combination of those experiences have got me where I am today.
Thank you all very much. And, I think that's a great point about, storytelling. And I also like the detective element as well. That's a structure I'm definitely going to borrow and include in my writing course, because I think that's an interesting way of thinking about, the work that scientists do. Let's move on and talk a little bit about, the article, and maybe just run through a couple of terms that I think, our listeners will appreciate having a little bit of perspective on. They're familiar, but they're not perhaps, familiar necessarily in this context. So, talking about things like, tragedies of the commons and common pool resource. And I was hoping you could give us a little bit of an overview of those and kind of how those relate to, ecology and conservation.
So maybe just to start, I think generally common pool resources are considered resources that are widely available in the landscape, usually on large areas, large regional areas perhaps, and they're difficult to exclude people from accessing. And so that's often what makes them common in terms of being accessible by a lot of people and hard to keep others out. And so that makes them challenging to manage and can potentially lead to the tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, and to add to what Karen said, part of the idea is that these are renewable resources and that they have to be shared or governed in some way. So when we think of forest or fisheries or timber and so forth, a part of the challenge is to preserve them. And if we kind of go back to the 60s, that is. One of the sort of dominant ideas at the time, which was posited by Garrett Hardin, an American ecologist, was that individuals are by their very nature selfish, and that the overuse of some of these resources that Karen described can lead to the tragedy of the commons. And that narrative has changed over the decades, and I'm particularly thinking of the Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom for showing that communities, local communities, be they fishers or small farmers, can actually sustain those resources in their community, and consequently reverse that tragedy. So, and I think what's really in our piece, what's been really nice to see is kind of the work that both Karen and Naima have done in the field, working with communities in various contexts to try to, decipher how communities actually persist and sustain their resources. And I think this piece is adding to kind of that tradition that counters the Hardin's narrative.
Yeah, and I think that, is an interesting point that conservation biology has to reckon with, that, kind of one of its foundational ideas is this notion that local communities may not be able to, or are suspected of not being able to, live in accord with the resources that are available to them. And, that obviously has problems both for the communities and for the practice of conservation itself. How has that played out over time, that failure to, elevate those communities that have been managing these resources since time immemorial?
So I'll jump in here and say that one of our central practices in conservation biology is centered around the creation, the establishment, and the management of protected areas. And by even the provisioning of protected areas, there's been displacement, right? And there's an acknowledgement that a Eurocentric approach is practically and substantially better in sustaining the resources than traditional ecological knowledges in these geographies that we're talking about. I think there's an increased recognition that these are not mutually exclusive, that when we're talking about how communities are using resources and what does things look like from a subsistence perspective versus commodifying or commercial or grand scale extraction, that those are not the same types of impact. Those are not the same types of technologies and degradation that happens in using the resources, right? So protected areas create this narrative of prohibitive action and prohibitive activities under this kind of misconception that that's what's best for the sustainability of the system and of the resources. And I think that we're continuing to challenge some of that narrative and others as well, recognizing that there are scales of impact and scales of use and an integration, and that protected areas are these coupled human natural ecosystems, and we have to manage and think inclusively both about the people dimension as well as the wildlife dimension.
Okay, and I'm going to jump in for a second and do something that's, abjectly evil, which is pitch my own podcast. And we had I think this is reminding me a lot of an episode we did a couple ago about, indigenous management of salmon fishery in, the North American Northwest. And the idea
I heard that episode.
You did. I'm glad. But yeah, but it seems to speak to exactly this kind of thing, where you have, the salmon resources managed over millennia as a, subsistence-based resource that everybody does fine. But when, you have the introduction of a commodification process, and then all of a sudden everything goes completely different, and, you lose the salmon. And now it's only now that they're starting to get back to, using some of those traditional techniques that you kind of see perhaps a light at the end of the tunnel.
The other thing I'll just quickly mention on this topic that I think is really important is that in this narrative, we've also kind of criminalized the activities of communities and using resources that they have traditionally used or have different kinds of spiritual or cultural significance, which again introduces these biases, introduces racist practices and white supremacy ideologies that their way is wrong and other people's ways are right. And that complicates the process as well.
Yeah, because it sounds like a lot of the time those who are, kind of doing the intellectual work around conservation, we're also coming at it from a perspective of, pristine wildlife must be protected. And, anything having to do with people interacting with that wildlife was, not acceptable. And so it criminalized a lot of activities. I think, Karen, can you tell us a little bit about the effects of protected areas on communities and how those can be, deleterious or challenging, and, kind of some of the ways that those can introduce some trouble?
Yeah, I think so. One really important piece is the way in which that criminalization of certain interactions and this idealized version of nature and wilderness and the environment as separate from people, it creates a narrow view of the ways in which we are allowed to interact with nature, right? We can just go and look at, for example, as opposed to interact with or live on or be culturally or spiritually connected to. And so it limits the conceptualization of what nature and wilderness is and our ability to build meaningful relationships with nature and the environment as well, which I think can be profoundly damaging to our sort of self-actualization and cultural and spiritual growth. It also really displaces potentially the costs and benefits of wildlife and nature and conservation. And so it potentially makes it so people in the global community have all of these large carnivores, for example, that exist and are happy and are surviving. But people who have lived next door or who are from cultures and communities who have lived next door and shared the landscape with these people for centuries, millennia, now are only getting the costs of living near those communities as opposed to any potential benefits from living near those wildlife communities. So I think those are two some sort of different negative outcomes, but really important and critical ones.
And also, I one thing mentioned in the article that seems maybe worth mentioning is that when you criminalize these activities, of interacting with a protected area, a lot of times there's not even the resources to enforce that anyway.
Right. Yeah. We've seen so much evidence about not only the sort of negative social and economic and cultural impacts of fortress conservation, to use that term, but also the fact that it doesn't necessarily achieve the conservation outcomes of interest because we don't have the resources to actually monitor and manage as we would like to. So I think it doesn't necessarily work for a multitude of reasons.
Okay, so we've got this I think model described a little bit of some of the ways that conservation can be ineffective, and it can come from a perspective that's not beneficial to the people who live there. It's not beneficial to really anybody because it's ineffective anyhow. What are some ways that potentially things could be done better? How can conservation work in a way that accords with the well-being of the people who are, on those landscapes and actually has the potential to be more effective?
How much time do we have to go over these recommendations?
We're going to solve all the world's problems in the next 24 minutes.
There are a lot.
Okay.
Because we have to make the distinction between like conservation science as the practice versus the science, right? Versus the scholarship, the way that researchers are approaching conservation in different regions of the world. And so what does models of co-production look like in terms of the research questions that even get asked? Are we doing the science that people want and will actually benefit from, right? And so that requires a different shift in our approaches to even doing our science. The other dimension of that then is who gets to then manage, implement the practices to ensure that the benefits are equitably distributed across the community right now. So now we have co-management kinds of scenarios that also have to get implemented so that the values and the priorities of communities are explicitly considered in the design. So I think that there's two tracks that we have to explicitly consider and recognize the distinction, and that both of those need to be happening.
Okay, and how does that kind of shake out in say an example? Is this what does collaboration with a local community look like in sort of a practical sense? Is it scientists on the ground during a field season? Is it law enforcement? How does one actually negotiate all of that stuff? I think for people like me who are not scientists and certainly not involved in kind of local administration of any sort, what does that actually kind of mean in a real sense and kind of on the ground?
I think Karen has quite a bit of experience with this as well. But I will say that paying a technician or field staff $2 a day is not part of it, right? That's not going to work.
Yeah. I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that part of the solution is recognizing the entire system within which Western science operates is extractive, right? So it's historically been go into a place, take knowledge, steal knowledge, potentially have negative impacts on local communities, and leave and go and do something great with it that benefits you and not necessarily them. And even when we think about the timescales on which our research operates, for example, the duration of a master's, the duration of a PhD, the duration of an NSF grant, it's not sufficient. None of those timeframes are sufficient for building meaningful relationships with local communities where you can be of service, which is sort of my ultimate goal. So I think it's just important to kind of lay out from the outset where we're coming from a system that has some serious problems in terms of doing this effectively. But I do think entering as someone who, certainly in the context of working in low and middle income countries, where I have historically done my research in Southern and East Africa, is coming in with an eye towards service. I have resources, I have skills, I have expertise, to use a term I don't love, but how can I serve your community, your landscape, and your needs? And so that use the language that was brought up earlier is thinking about knowledge co-production and research co-production, developing research projects that are responsive to local needs and that are building capacity, that are training scientists to continue to do the work, that are building communities and community resources and getting community engagement and empowerment in the process of doing the science as well.
Which does require us to invest in a significant amount of consultation, which is generally not our like ivory tower model, right? It's, I'm brilliant, I have this grand idea, and let me wave carrots of money and resources and technology, and they give me permission to do what I want to do, right? Changing that and even thinking about co-production means that you have to go into places that are unfamiliar as an observer, as a listener, as a partner, right? But you have to consult all through the process. And generally, that's not how we're trained, with these social skills, with these communication skills, with these negotiation skills. That's not the way that science generally approaches the system. And so we do have to rethink what does points of entry look like to ensure that we are, again, equitably distributing benefits and resources, and really as a partner, right? It is not me spearheading or championing or leading every single dimension, right? I'm relying on the expertise that's there, and I need their help too, right? There's an exchange that has to happen. But if we're not going in with that philosophy, the product that we produced is going to be biased, inequitable, unjust, et cetera.
Yeah, and I would imagine that because this isn't a part of the traditional model of the way that, Western science has been conducted, you'd have to create a lot of this on the fly as you were working as well.
I would add one thing in addition to all the brilliant things that have been said. I think there's also something fundamental to the scientific process as well, because this leads to questions of who gets to do science, who gets to. I think Naima likes to. Her lab is called the awe lab, if I'm not mistaken. Who gets to be in awe of the processes around us? Who's allowed to ask questions? And I think by essentially excluding folks from the process of doing science, because I think we all believe that everyone is genuinely interested in how the world operates and is curious and so forth, but only a sliver of the population is allowed to exercise that formally by, for example, working in the institutions that we are in. And I think part of this idea of bringing in more people, local communities, is to also extend that the joy of what got us here to begin with. So and I think by taking that away, we're also doing not only disservice to those communities in question, but also to this thing that we are all fascinated by, science.
No, that's a great point. And Senna, I'm also wondering about, of course, in looking at all of this, we have to look at the backdrop against which it all occurs. And that is in many senses that we have a very rapidly changing world, in a very real physical sense with, climate change. We've seen in this past 18 months or so, the emergence of a disease that has, kind of changed everything about our lives. What's kind of the role of disease and this, this backdrop and, increasing spillover of zoonotic illnesses, kind of how does all of that play into, what you've been talking about so far today?
I think one key element that unites us all together, wherever we are in the world, is how interconnected we are, and we're seeing that with the spread of infectious diseases. Today, it's COVID, but it has been influenza, it has been SARS, et cetera, in the past. And what we're now facing with global change, be it the result of climate change or urbanization or the increasing contact between humans and wildlife, is that you have these pathogens, oftentimes zoonotic, that are spilling over, and the sort of intermediate host oftentimes are domestic animals. And so by getting into closer contact, and now because we're interconnected through airplanes from one continent to another, we're sort of exacerbating this process. But I think at the heart of this is how human activities, largely driven by the sort of economic interests that are expanding agriculture. If you look today at places like Brazil or Indonesia, where we're having producing monocrops, which is another form where diseases can expand, or in other cases where you have close contact with wildlife because of forest patches that get cleared in rainforest. We're seeing the continued outbreaks of some of these infectious diseases, and it's not only the ecology that's driving that, but it's also the evolution. And so you have this feedback between the ecology and evolution, which is creating these variants that we're now dealing with. And I think we're seeing now that massive investment is necessary, not only in the United States and say Europe, but the rest of the world, and that has been lagging. So when we think of vaccine distribution or any other type of control measures, we're seeing inequities in those processes as well, and obviously the groups that are bearing the brunt, Black and Latino communities here in the United States, and of course, throughout Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia, we're seeing the effects on vulnerable communities in those places, and oftentimes it's the people that suffer the most that didn't by all measure contribute the most to it.
Okay, and on the disease front, why don't we talk a little bit about an example where things have been done in a slightly more equitable way? So, Senai, can you tell us a little bit about the Baltimore Mosquito Project?
Yeah, the Baltimore Mosquito Study is a very innovative program, a partnership between the Carey Institute, the City of Baltimore, and the Forest Service, where local community members are engaged in understanding disease outbreaks pertaining to mosquitoes. And in this partnership, local communities engage with the ecologists to try to understand both the mosquito ecology as well as very important urban features that have resulted in those outbreaks. So we can think of, for example, the history of zoning and redlining in Baltimore, as well as monetary divestment and segregation of communities as a result of highways that were placed in predominantly Black communities. And so by bringing in local communities and bringing in their local, their stories and their experiences and their narratives, we can present a fuller picture of the relationship between these coupled and human environmental interaction, and hope to resolve disease outbreaks in relation to mosquitoes in the city of Baltimore.
Yeah, and so I think Senai, types of environmental justice projects and coupled human, natural, and socio-ecological systems projects that are explicitly looking at some of the historical injustices that have led to differences in environmental patterns and trends and ecological changes is something that I experienced both in a domestic and international setting, and linked to my earlier when I was talking about my sort of transition and my trajectory to where I am now. I went from being sort of a pure traditional ecologist to being a social scientist because I was trapping rodents and doing ecological research in Southern Africa during the midst of a severe drought. And while people were starving, and I was asking them about rats, and they were like, "What are you doing?" But really, what happened is I sort of recognized that the same systems that lead to negative climate change and the negative impacts that communities who didn't cause climate change are experiencing disproportionately are linked to environmental degradation and are linked to issues of environmental justice domestically, and are linked to the experiences that I've had growing up in South Central Los Angeles, and that my mom had growing up in Tennessee in the 60s. And so it was this shift to kind of understanding that environmental justice issues are happening at a global scale and locally affecting my communities, and was this desire to kind of take a human environment approach to the system as opposed to the ecological approach, which is what I essentially had been trained and learned about for the entirety of my academic life up to that point. So I think it just kind of links to the importance of that embodiment and seeing yourselves and your communities in that work and recognizing the injustices that have occurred that have both social and environmental impacts.
Yeah, and I think I'm really getting the sense that, kind of the overwhelming theme here is that, if you don't take everything into consideration, you wind up with some significant shortcomings. But let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about funding, because obviously that is an important element of all of this. And it kind of, determines where the rubber meets the road in terms of what science gets done. And, researchers such as yourselves have typically not been the recipients of funding at the scales that others potentially have. So I was hoping you could talk just a little bit about, funding, the shortcomings, what should be done better, and those types of issues.
Yeah, I think one important factor that was highlighted by both Karen and Naima is that there is lack of funding for both true conservation efforts, but we're also seeing that more recently with infectious diseases. So there has been a study by the NIH basically showing that Black scientists receive less funding than their white counterparts. This is predominantly the study is predominantly conducted among biomedical scientists, but we can kind of assume that will extend beyond that domain. And what we're seeing is that one of the key factors is the systemic racism, frankly, that the way research is funded and the types of research that is funded really biases Black scientists, particularly those that propose to do some sort of community interventions in local communities. And of course, we know that it's oftentimes the preventative measures that can actually help communities rather than after the fact. And I think it also has a big impact on working scientists, because the way the system works is that if you don't have a grant, then you basically can't really pursue your research, and there are all kinds of considerations for keeping your job. So it not only has an impact on local communities, but also has an impact on working scientists. And some of the things that have been proposed to mitigate the training courses for systemic bias and so forth, I frankly don't think are sufficient enough. I think we need to go to a model that, now that we know what the problem is, we actually should focus on finding a solution. I think one of the solutions is to fund Black scientists directly for their work. And we can think of different kinds of models of how that would take place, but we know that Black scientists are not funded at the same rate that the other groups are funded. And so I think in order to address this, I think we have to fund those scientists and bring in more scientists, because we're only talking about those that are professional scientists, but we also have to think about the future scientists that are coming, and if we don't deal with it now, then this will have perpetuating effects down the road.
Yeah, when we look at, we mentioned NIH, we can also look at NSF, who hasn't been forthcoming with said information. And when questioned and kind of asked about it, there's, questions or issues around reporting or collecting the demographic information. So we kind of can't make the assessments. But the reality is that the expectations are the same, and that Black scientists are less funded, likely, in NSF as well. And we know that NSF has programs at the postdoctoral level for broadening participation, right? I got one of those awards as a postdoc. And when I became a faculty, I was like, all right, where's the broadening participation award NSF at the faculty level? And I certainly didn't find it. Maybe it's there, but I don't see it. And so keeping the acknowledgement that there are different funding mechanisms that need to be in place in order to support Black scientists, again, from this Blackologist perspective, because we're fundamentally highlighting that the way that we're going to do our research, the types of questions that we're going to ask, the intersectionality between our identity and the science is going to be there, which means, yes, that represents a different funding stream that may not be consistent with the current paradigm and require some expansion and broadening and innovation. The same part, or the additional component to that, is the reviewers, right? So who's actually making the decisions, right? The program officers, et cetera, but they're taking recommendations from a review panel. The same thing with the publications, right? There's a review process that determines what makes it through the shiny pearly gates and what doesn't, right? And so where are our voices heard and elevated? Where is our science and intellectual merit celebrated? Means that our peers, again, have to recognize the intellectual merit of our work. And given the biases and the racism that exists, those barriers remain extremely pronounced, that require the scrutiny and require a process literally of dismantling.
And I would say, related to that, I think a key kind of soapbox that I've been on lately is the importance of bringing humanity into our science, importance of the narratives and the stories of scientists, and recognizing these intersections between identity, society, and science. And I think linking that and encouraging review panels, encouraging reviewers, encouraging funders to amplify work that does make those links explicit. Again, pushing back on the historical framework that has attempted to disembody science, which doesn't make any sense, to make it completely separate from the scientists, to strengthen funding streams for folks who are thinking about that intersection and that embodiment of science as well is really important.
Yeah, so it really sounds like you're working against a lot of, entrenched bias and entrenched practice, and possibly the ways through that are by building some systems that will address it, and also by encouraging those who are at funding agencies and working on review as well to take the kinds of things that you're saying into consideration.
Yeah, and I think I would add to what has been said is that, this is also an opportunity, I think, for us scientists, broadly speaking, to organize ourselves, in the sense of being inside of those institutions, because if we're not inside of them, the decision making is not going to change. And I think one outcome that I've enjoyed is our organization that we all co-founded, the Blackologists section, which is a lot of what spurred this article within the Professional Society of the Ecological Society of America, is that we all came together realizing what the gaps were and how it was posing essentially a threat to our existence. And by organizing ourselves, we have attempted to address some of these issues within our own society. And I think if we hadn't come together as a group, people wouldn't have listened, and I think oftentimes we see, there's this mentality of these courageous individuals, but I think, those are exactly the situations where institutions can shun those individuals, and what we have to do collectively is come together and organize ourselves to change the course.
Tonight we're under threat. We're an endangered species here. Sorry.
No, I think that's really well put. And I'm wondering now, let's talk a little bit about what's next for this work. So I think we've got a great overview of some of the key points that you've made in the article, and I think our listeners will have learned a lot. But what's next? What are the next steps? What are you working on right now? What can we look forward to?
So we recognize the process of dismantling some of these biases in the context of the funding cycles and evaluative processes, et cetera. We also recognize that it exists in a publishing context, that publishing is very much a part, and especially in an academic setting, of our evaluations and merit raises and promotions, et cetera, and that there's a substantial amount of gatekeeping and challenges when it comes to Black voices, again, being presented and elevated. And so certainly having, editors in bioscience, et cetera, being willing to elevate our voices, but we need that not to be one-offs. We need it to be a substantial cultural shift, and that's expected, that Black voices, Black excellence, Black scholars are elevated in every issue, in every journal across the board. And so we are working on what we're calling a blackout across the Ecological Society of America journals, where we are coordinating a special feature across multiple of their journals that are promoting Black scientists, either as the first author or the senior author. And so we are working really hard to put that together and really, again, celebrate the contributions that we're making, that certainly Black scientists are here, we are here to stay, but it requires some extra work. And so that's one of the initiatives that we're working on now and really excited about.
Yeah, I'm excited to be a part of that effort. I'm excited to try and embed this goal of infusing humanity, of embodying the whole person in the research that I do and the way that I work with students as well. And then also, again, thinking about the systems within which we operate academic institutions, more informal kind of ecological training settings, and thinking about what the experiences are for students, for scholars in those spaces, and how we can improve them to support retention and longevity in this field for these people who bring in this perspective that's relevant, that is intersectional, that is just, that is equitable, or at least considering justice and equity in a way that our science hasn't historically. So that's a lot of what I'm thinking about in my future efforts.
Yeah, and I'll just add, in addition to what was said about the blackout issue, I'm very excited to be collaborating with Professor Matthew McCary at Rice University, and also one of the co-authors of our paper on this issue, linking infectious diseases with particular linkages to urban communities. And so very much looking forward to having that come out in the future. I also want to shout out our other co-authors, Shakara Tyler and Jeremy Strickland, who have done a phenomenal job. And the last thing I'll say, and this kind of relates to the point Karen made, is that one of my ambitions sort of in the long term is to try to bring in everyone, kind of, if we think of as a jazz orchestra, you got the trumpet player, the saxophone, the cello, the drummer, and all of them, create that beautiful sound, right? And that's part of the great Black experience that brought us this American music. And I think in a similar vein, we can do the same thing for scientists. So whether it's the custodian down the hall, the security guard, the brother, standing at the door, can we bring those folks in through our storytelling? Because I believe, irrespective of our social and economic positions in life, I think everyone is curious. Everyone has a yearning for knowledge and creativity. So bringing those folks in is a sort of a mission that I have for myself.
So now you have such an amazing gift about making science come alive in the analogies that you use. As you were explaining this orchestra, I'm like, okay, yeah, because then you have this section and we got to focus on tuning this section first in order to get to harmony with this section. Like, I loved it. I literally came alive for me. So thank you.
Thank you. I wish I did more of my practicing of scales, though. I should be doing a little bit more of that, but that's a whole nother issue. My music teacher won't be happy with that, but anyways.
Great. Thank you very much. And I appreciate your inviting me into this conversation. I think we've covered a lot of great ground, and I look forward to seeing what's next. And I hope you'll all come back and talk to me again one of these days. Thank you very much for joining me.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, James.
And that concludes this episode of Bioscience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal Bioscience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.